Good evening, and welcome to Woman. My guest this evening is Susan Braudy. Susan lives in New York City, where she is an editor and writer for Ms. Magazine. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Village Voice, and Harper's. She is the author of Between Marriage and Divorce, a very personal account of her marriage and subsequent divorce. Susan, welcome to Woman.
Thank you, Sandy.
Susan, you make a very large point in the book of being a child of the 60s. How do you think that affected what happened to you later on?
Well, I think my dreams for marriage, or what I was told through television and by my parents, led me to believe that it was going to be this incredible sort of high romantic experience. When I was a kid, I used to watch the I Love Lucy show, and at a certain point at the end of the show, Desi Arnaz would throw up his hands after a minor tiff, and he'd say, "That's why I love Lucy." And I'd say, "Oh, that's nice, you know, a married couple." And then I read in the paper that they were divorced, and they continued to do the show. And it confused me, and it made me feel like looking at them saying, what is it about these people? What terrible secrets do they have? I mean, you know, that I can't sort of figure out in their relationship that brings up this sort of nameless horror divorce. And then my mother's brother was divorced, and my mother didn't find out about it for about 7 months, and I wasn't told about it for about 7 months after that. And I never got a satisfactory explanation, you know, for what it was. I mean, I was always to concentrate on the perfect marriage and how I was to sort of achieve it, which was very nebulous.
Do you think the 60s were any different from the 50s or the 40s or the 30s, really?
Probably not. I think what happened, and I was almost really brought up in the 50s. I mean, I'm 34, so you would count me a 50s person almost. I think that people, well, I think that people had fewer expectations maybe earlier on. I mean, a friend of mine's father once said to her, she was leaving her husband, and he kept saying, "Why?" And she said, "Well, Dad, I'm not happy." And he said, "Happy? Who's supposed to be happy?" And I think that maybe earlier, people just sort of lived very quietly and didn't expect maybe as much from marriage as we suddenly began to in the 50s and the 60s. I mean, we expect one and only soulmate, bedmate, confidant, best friend, share your private time, share your leisure time activities. I mean, it's all supposed to just be, you know, one package kind of. And I think it's an awful lot of pressure to put on one person or one relationship.
Do you think women who are young, the age you were in the 50s and 60s, in the 70s, do you think they are thinking differently?
Well, that's interesting. I teach at Brooklyn College, and I've talked to a lot of my female students, and I think they know the sort of the slogans of how to think differently, and they know that they have more options in a certain way. But I think deep down, they still sort of feel that their lives will be completed, and they will be complete women when they marry.
Do you think there are common experiences in marriage and divorce, no matter what your educational background, your social status is, or your color, or whatever?
Oh, definitely. I think there's an incredible, well, first of all, for women especially, an incredible feeling of both public and private failure. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was I wanted to suggest that it wasn't that each person sort of privately and sort of furtively fails and can't talk about it and has to be sort of swept under a rug, but that maybe there's something about the institution itself that's failing us, and we should just stand up and kind of talk about it, you know?
I asked you that because I know you've been on a book tour recently, publicizing your book, and I wondered if women came up to you, women with children who have been divorced, or black women who are not in the same economic category that you are, if they said to you, "Look, Susan, you don't have anything to say to us, really."
Oh, no, no. In fact, several women in New York, too, have, besides on my book tour, have talked to me about how the private, you know, the sort of, what I did was try to trace my sort of emotional journey, the sort of in this unraveling period. And your feelings are very similar. Of course, I didn't have the incredible sense of responsibility toward children, which is very important and has often held marriages together through very difficult periods. But I think your sort of private, your feelings are very similar.
Yeah, I agree that it's painful no matter what.
Yeah.
And that rich, poor, whatever,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. It's a bad experience for both men and women.
Yeah. Even though you sort of start out thinking, I'll do it. You sort of vary between incredible elation. I mean, a lot of people lose weight during that period. You go incredibly elated. I'll do it. I can survive. I can take care of myself. And then you sort of wake up in the morning and you think, oh, you know, I can't. Why should I? Why should I eat my protein, you know, brush my teeth when, you know, when the person who was closest to me has now sort of rejected me in effect or has left me, you know. And for me, my former husband, as for many people, was like my mirror in a certain way. I mean, I really did bounce most my ideas off of him, and sort of just felt that, you know, together we maybe made a person in some way, or maybe 1.5 people.
Before we talk about your divorce, let's talk about your marriage a little bit. What did you expect it to be like before you were married?
Well, I just remember when it was sort of formless in a way, but when I was about 18, my husband-to-be, it's hard to name him each different way, slipped a sort of a paper cigar band on my finger. And I don't think I've ever been happier, because suddenly all the expectations of my parents, all the things that I expected would happen to me when I grow up, were going to fall into place. I mean, I was going to have a Prince Charming, he was a very kind person, still is, someone, I guess, to take care of me, actually. I mean, so I wouldn't have to worry about money. It would just sort of complete my life in ways that I couldn't figure out, because I wasn't exactly sure what my life would be like. I mean, marriage is a promise made between children, and it's interesting that you do feel this incredible sense of failure, but it is, after all, a promise for the rest of your life, contracted by children often. In my case, I was 21.
Do you feel he was also acting out his role?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think that he wanted very much to be responsible and adult and male and sort of, in general, a patriarchal sort of person, you know.
Do you think it made any difference that you were 21 when you got married? Do you think if you had waited longer? I mean, I hear people say all these things, you know, if only I were older, if only I knew more.
I don't know. Maybe. I think that what might have made it a big difference is if I had felt that I had the option not to marry all along. I mean, if I had felt that, oh, well, I could live with someone, I could share my private life with a man, I could share my private life with one man, break up the relationship, then share my private life with another man. But I didn't feel that. I felt that once I slept with a man, I then had to marry him, and that if I didn't, I would be a failure even then. And I guess in a certain way, without exaggerating it, I was probably desperate, but I didn't know that. I just figured this was what I had to do. I mean, it was more important than going to graduate school, although that was sort of important too.
So really, you were more prepared for marriage than anything?
Yeah.
You weren't at that time really a journalist?
No. No.
You also talk a little bit in the book about fixing up your apartment so that you would have sort of the perfect nest. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it was a very, it was a great experience for me. I mean, I just remember when we first started going out, you know, I all of a sudden became very interested in fixing up my college room. I mean, I got a used hi-fi set, and I sort of put it in there, and I pictured it was there because of we would be there together. And my apartment was really sort of a mess. It was a rented apartment, and it was just one room, and it was an attic. But I painted the ladder leading from the living room to the roof, and it was very important for me to get that ladder really painted well, and it was for us and for him, and it was just this whole sort of building our nest thing.
How did your friends see your marriage?
Oh, well, that's really interesting, because we were really, everyone said to us that we were the perfect couple, and we took great pride in it, and I think that was in some way our undoing, or in a major way, the undoing of the marriage, because we never really wanted to confront each other about things that either made me feel guilty, like in my case going away for weekends to do reporting assignments, or in his case maybe his feeling lonely when I went away. We never really confronted each other because we wanted to keep this sort of perfect couple image. And then when my marriage broke up, I would sort of say, well, gee, everybody thought we were the perfect couple, and then I wrote in my book, somebody said to me, you know, dummy, when you're married, everybody says you're the perfect couple, and it's when you break up that suddenly the Greek chorus dies down.
Is it necessary for you to know why your marriage broke up, or do you know?
I think I could speak about it, or you know, but I think that it takes years to understand it. I mean, I think it's very easy to have hindsight, and in the book I write about revisionism. I mean, suddenly you go the day of my wedding, you know, I was only thinking about, you know, the things you read in women's magazines, and about floral bouquets and the love story and stuff. And then when people's marriages break up, they say things like, well, I only married her because she really played tennis well, and so did I, or I was tired of sleeping in my parents' house, I wanted a house of my own. And people just go through this incredible flip-flop. And it's really interesting. It's because the dream has failed them, so they have to pretend in order to sort of revive the dream that, well, that was just a mistake. I mean, I'll get the dream going again in another, you know, with another person or with another situation. So they just, I call it revisionism. Just, you know, just turn it.
You talk about the dreams, and it's what I call rumors. You know, the rumors we hear about how things are supposed to be. And I think one of the major causes of dissatisfaction within a marriage is the rumors we hear about sex and fidelity and that kind of thing. I mean, we hear how many orgasms we're supposed to have. We hear, you know, what the ideal couple, how many times a week they have sex and that kind of thing. Do you think that was had any kind of influence on your marriage?
Oh, I think so. I think you see that I went from being living a very sort of what you would call middle American life to living in New York, where suddenly everyone was very chic and saying, oh, you know, sort of that we seemed square and, you know, because we were married and somehow it was practically a child marriage. Yes, I think definitely that it became those kinds of expectations maybe substituted a little bit or even added more pressure to the ones that I was brought up to have, which were, you know, romance, love, devotion. Yeah, I think so. I think people do exaggerate the absolute, and why not? It's a big rule, but the absoluteness of adultery and the finality of, you know, sort of being attracted to other people. And I mean, like women get sad if their husbands say they're attracted to other women or whatever.
You also said that at the time you were going to a psychiatrist and you didn't really talk about your relationship with your psychiatrist because you felt it would be a betrayal.
Yeah, well, I always felt that was another thing. There's a certain point at which I began to think that maybe married people can be among the loneliest people in the world, because you have this relationship and either you're extraordinarily deft and strong and you sort of confront the other person with either your dissatisfactions or your pleasures and you're really upfront about it, or you create these private spaces, each person sort of separate, and there are these spaces between you. And then you have these spaces and you have these major things in your life that you're not talking about and you don't really want to talk about, maybe even to your best friends, because after all, this is your private relationship. It's like talking behind somebody's back. And I sort of had that feeling. When I first went to see a psychiatrist, I went to see her because I felt that I was blocking in my writing. And I didn't really want to talk about my then husband because I knew he wasn't talking to anybody about me, and it was a point of honor in a way, which I think is wrong now. I mean, I really think that once my marriage broke up, I mean, I began to have whole different kinds of dialogues with people. I mean, my married friends would come to me and tell me about crises they'd had or how the specific details of their life fell short of the dream that they were brought up to believe in, and whether or not they dissolved their marriage on the basis of it or whether they kept it going. And it was just like I was living in a totally different world.
But it was a conspiracy, though, really, wasn't it?
Silence, yeah. Yeah.
And that's such a devastating thing.
Yeah, but you know, it's really ordinary. It's the most ordinary thing. I mean, it's just really
How do you
happens.
know that, Susan?
Well, I mean, I'm a reporter, and I also became incredibly curious about this one thing, and I just keep talking to people and talking to them. And especially now that I wrote this book as a magazine article for Ms. about 3 years ago. And suddenly, I became part of this dialogue. Even before that, I did, though, because my friends would come to me and say, well, you know, and then people who had been divorced, who'd been sort of quietly sort of swept under a rug, and then they sort of reemerged and didn't talk about it, suddenly began to talk to me, and I began to talk to them. It's like, someone once said, not that I think getting divorced is like having an accident, but it's similar. Her son walked into a glass door once, and she was sitting in the hospital waiting room shaking and thinking, how can I survive this? And she started talking to some people, and suddenly each one of them produced either a relative or a friend, or even one person himself had walked into a glass door and survived. And I think that's what happens in a way. I mean, from being sort of, I'm not going to do anything but not look at my perfect marriage, to what happened. Suddenly, a lot of people are around to quiz about, you know, well, what happened to you, what happened to you?
There was another aspect of your marriage that you thought at the time was unique, and that was you had an affair at one point.
Yes.
And I must say, it's one of the funniest accounts. I really laughed because there's a lot to identify with, I think, for a lot of people, both men and women. You know, people who reach points in their marriage where they're not quite sure that things are going well, but maybe they don't want to ask questions to find out. Mm-hmm. And they maybe are looking and so on. Can you talk about what happened to you when that was happening? I don't want, you know, the details, but I want you to talk about what you were feeling then.
Well, it's interesting because now I can say with hindsight, I say, well, adultery, as they call it, I mean, there should be a better word than adultery, it sounds so grim and punitive.
Yeah, right.
Is a way of making friends in a certain way. It's not necessarily a cause of marriage breakup, it's a symptom that you sort of need to make friends and you're feeling lonely. And in my case, it was incredible because I never even entertained the idea that I would ever sleep with anybody except for my then husband. I mean, that was it. And I kept thinking, well, maybe this isn't happening to me. And if it is happening to me, maybe I can pretend it isn't. And I began to feel very desperately crazy. I mean, I was sort of cut off. And I kept sort of trying to pretend it wasn't happening, whereas it was consuming a lot of my energy, both in the thinking of it and then partly in the doing of it. And I think it was just doing something. It was a way. For me, it was a way of making friends in a different way. And it was a way of saying, hey, wait a minute, can I be an adult without being so dependent on this one person that I'm married to? But it's going to take me a long time to really figure it out. I just don't think that people should think what I did, which is, this marriage is probably over. I mean, it's taken me a long time to realize that, too, that when that happened, I was so sort of consumed with guilt and desperation that I figured, well, this is a terrible thing that happened to me.
So are you saying that you think that that maybe is what did it for your marriage?
Well, it's funny, but I've been just thinking that in the past couple months. I didn't think that when I was writing the book, which was very much done immediately. It was taken from diaries, and it was mostly my subjective impressions. But I do think that I sort of began to feel, yes, the dream. I mean, I didn't even think marriage included the idea of adultery. I mean, I would hear comedians on television joking about, you know, husbands kind of looking over women and stuff like that, but that was a joke. And I never talked to anybody about adultery, as we're calling it. And when it happened, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought, well, I mean, wasn't, you know, I'm this, you know, middle-class person, and this doesn't happen, you know.
But you were aware of the divorce statistics, weren't you? I mean, you just didn't apply them.
I don't think I was. You know, I since know that over 2 out of 5 marriages do end in divorce, and that was one of the reasons I decided to write the book, because I was sort of thinking, you know, how could this happen to me? I mean, it was never, you know, I did not plan this for myself, you know, and I say in the book that my face felt like a giant tear duct. I'd been crying for 2 days. This was when my husband left, and then suddenly I thought, wait a minute, you know, this isn't just you. I mean, if over 2 out of 5 marriages have ended in divorce in this country, that means that maybe 2 out of 5 adults have felt this bad at some point. How come nobody ever talked to you about it? And then that was when I began to sort of start talking to people and began to think, well, there's this incredible hypocrisy that we live by, where we, when we're married, we cross our fingers and don't look too closely at things as a rule, and when we get divorced, we retire gracefully for a few months, and then we come out and chances are remarry. I mean, if you've been married, chances are much higher that you'll marry again.
Whenever I think of the divorce statistics, I think about all the people who are hanging on in marriages who will probably not get divorced for, you know, whatever reasons, children or whatever. And I think that's even more alarming. I mean, it's an incredible indictment.
I know, we should have the option. I mean, this is very hard to keep this in mind all the time, and sometimes I waver. But I can say that it's really interesting. Since I've been dismarried, I've never been sort of jealous of a wife, you know, or sort of looked longingly at a wife and said, gee, that's the position I want for myself. I think it's really interesting that going from this incredible feeling of horror and pain at losing this sort of situation and this man that I loved, still I haven't come to a place where I yet want to repeat it, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think it's important, though, to believe. It was something which I never believed when I was 20 or when I was from 8 to 28 maybe, that I had the option to just be an adult living on my own by myself, taking care of myself. Very important for me. It's almost overly important for me to pay for myself. I really feel this incredible need to establish my independence of other people's financial help. And
it obviously was a terrific shock to you to react the way you reacted.
Yes, it was.
Do you think that was because people don't talk about what happens to you after?
Yes, you know, it's interesting, too, because I've talked to 2 men now. I think men talk even less about it than women. I mean, we've really learned, even more than we used to talk to each other, you know, basically because of the women's movement, I think. But I've talked to 2 men who were divorced, or one had just been separated, and I would say to them at the point that they had been separated, well, gee, how do you feel? How do you feel about it? And they'd say, oh, I feel okay, I feel fine. And I'd say, well, I mean, of course, but I'd heard that you were upset. No, I'm not upset. And then both of these guys read my book, and they said, boy, did we really identify with you. I know exactly what you went through. Boy, you know, that was really something. Boy, I couldn't put it down. That's really strange, because they had just told me the opposite. And yes, I think it's not considered good form. I think it's considered unpleasant to sort of go on about. And also, I think it's almost considered by married people in a funny way as catching. Because it's so mysterious, this thing that you have, this bond that you're not maybe looking at ultra closely. You know, I think you don't want to sort of be contaminated in a certain way. I was reading, at one point when I was writing the book, I was trying to read sort of sources, and I decided to read etiquette books to see what women and men should do. And Amy Vanderbilt said women should more or less hide. I mean, that you, as a man, you shouldn't flaunt it too much. I mean, well, you should pretty well try not to take a lot of different women to dinner parties, you know. But as a woman, maybe you should send out cards the first month, just send out cards with I think she said you should put your married name in the middle, like you should go first name, married name, single name, and sort of make that announcement. But that you shouldn't appear in public even. I mean, that would be your shame.
There seems to be no place in our society where we can discuss this. I mean, certainly you don't hear it discussed on television very much. You don't read that many books that are very, very honest about the pain, the feeling of rejection, and so on. I suppose maybe consciousness-raising groups, some of the women's colleges and so on are making places, but I don't know of any other place, do you?
No, it's interesting, but I heard about seminars in marriage for married couples in the Midwest when I was there recently, and I think it was at the University of Minnesota, where married couples are supposed to get together and talk about their marriages, and that's sort of interesting. But you know, I wrote in my book that Margaret Mead said that most cultures have like platitudes that everybody is supposed to publicly sort of give lip service to, say they live up to, and then they sort of privately, furtively, shamefully fail. And that she says that monogamous marriage is like that for us. That we all sort of stand up and say, yes, and if it didn't work the first time, I'll try it again. But basically, we spend our time trying to sort of sort out the baggage in our minds because it's failing, because we're failing at doing it.
Do you still feel rejected?
Yeah, probably. But I also feel very sort of adult, you know. I mean, I really feel that I can, in a way that I wasn't allowed to do either by, and it wasn't my ex-husband's fault, by some compact in my marriage, so some contract that we made. I didn't become an adult. I didn't take care of myself. And I feel really good that I do now. And I only feel, rejected maybe, it always has to be percentages. I feel maybe 10% rejected. And I don't even think it's rational, but I'm not saying that you always feel what you think you should feel.
I wonder how, if you were going to try to tell someone how to cope with that, what you would say.
People have written me letters about it, and I think the most important thing is to talk to other people. I mean, if 65 people get together and say, gee, it feels funny to walk on this floor, I feel like the floor's on a slant, then maybe everybody would say, yeah, that floor's slanted, you know. I mean, I just think you shouldn't just sort of do what I was awfully tempted to do. Just stay home and hide. I mean, friends would invite me to like dinner parties and stuff in New York, and I'd say, oh, sure, I'm coming. And I'd say, I'm not going to go. And then like about an hour before I'd call and say, I have a headache, or I just as soon stay home. And they really made me feel like I was among the living during that period because they wouldn't let me hide. And I would go to these parties and I would think, my God, these people are so trivial. How can they talk about cats or, plays or the latest movie or the front page of the Times, the New York Times, when I have this incredible thing that I'm thinking about all the time. My whole life is changing. I don't know who I am anymore. But then I'd think about how my cat, yes, behaves a certain way, or it would be interesting to see a certain play, and I would sort of get, as I say, pulled back into the living. And I just think even that level of conversation is important. But I really think you should be really just talking about what it is that you say, ouch, when you have a pain. And you'd be surprised at how many other people.
Has anyone said to you that at the beginning of the book you come off very naive?
Yeah. I think I'm still in a strange way naive, but I think it's a hard thing to admit. You know, I'm an adult, I do things a certain way. Even you hear people say I'm a liberated woman or whatever. And it's much harder to say these are my naive dreams for myself, or these are the way I expected life to be, and this is how I've been disappointed by it. And this is how I refuse to accept the changes that I must make in my particular dreams for my life, or my myths even.
Do you have any contact with your ex-husband at all?
Yes, I do. I don't have a lot. I gave him the first copy of my book.
I'm sure he was thrilled.
Well, he was sort of sweet about it. I wrote volume 1, number 1 on it. And
are you totally pessimistic about marriage? I mean, you make statements like, the institution has failed us, we have not failed the institution.
I'm not pessimistic about marriage, but I do believe that it's an extraordinary thing that we can make a voluntary commitment in our adult lives based on love, and then create an institution around it that is probably the most important institution we have. I mean, because having a child, you don't love the child before you have it, although you probably will. I mean, you will love the child. But I do think we really have to change what we expect from it, because I mean, it's absolutely true that people are putting more and more pressure on the institution, wanting it to be more and more sort of satisfying in some way, and more unreal in some way, and failing at it. So we have to scale down our expectations in the same way I think that women have to scale down their expectations of men. I mean, I think that at a certain point, I think women in the women's movement wouldn't be as angry at men if they didn't expect as much from them. I think we should expect to sort of cure ourselves more or less. And I think that a lot of the sort of divorce rate is based on a sort of anger at our dreams that have failed us for marriage.
Now you work for Ms., and so one can make the assumption that you're very involved in the women's movement, yet the book is not political. It's personal instead. Now, did you make a choice?
Well, I think I make a choice in the way I think about things. I mean, I used to work at Newsweek, and I think if I worked at Newsweek, I would be more actively politically feminist. Working at Ms., I have this feeling that we all know sort of the 5 slogans of feminism. And the hard thing is to make these slogans sort of fit into our lives. It's the same thing as, it's going from one hard dream to another. You go from the dream of being a perfect wife to being the perfect feminist. I mean, and there are millions of ways that every one of us fails at doing each of these things every day. And I think that what we have to do is sort of gather evidence and talk to people and just sort of slowly work, you know, to build ourselves as maybe strong, you know, adult women, rather than sort of just memorize a lot of things to say that make us angry, you know.
What about now, this minute, kind of? I mean, where's your head at this point?
In terms of marriage or in general?
Yeah, just in terms of yourself.
Well, I guess that I am enormously surprised at the number of things that I can do and the way I feel. I just feel that I'm 34 years old and I can do most things much better than I ever thought I could. And sometimes I feel lonely, and most of the time I just feel that life is opening up in very interesting ways. And most of all, I feel that I do have the option to marry or not marry, which is something I just never felt before.
Well, I hope we've made maybe a small beginning about talking about the very personal part of divorce. Susan, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and good night.